Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I am president of the City Club's Board of Directors. 2 weeks ago at the City Club, the Speaker and the Minority Leader of the Ohio House of Representatives participated on a rather interesting and informative panel. One of the discussion subjects was the legislative redistricting process in Ohio in the aftermath of the November 2010 election in which the Republican Party regained control. I am pleased to introduce today's presenters, Mark Salling and Myrna Pérez, who will address the redistricting process in Ohio and nationally. As you will hear, it is a process that varies across our states and significantly impacts our democracy. Dr. Salling earned his Bachelor of Arts and Doctorate in Geography from Kent State University and a Master's in Geography from the University of Cincinnati. He serves as Director for the Northern Ohio Data and Information Services at the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University and is a Levin College Fellow. As Director, he manages a team involved in data dissemination, demographic analysis, and urban and geographic information systems, or GIS, applications. Dr. Salling also serves as a Research Director at the Center for Community Solutions, chairs the Cleveland Region Census Statistical Areas Committee, and is Ohio's liaison to the Census Bureau on redistricting data programs. He is active at the national level with several organizations, including the Urban and Regional Information Systems Association, from whom he received service awards in 1987 and 2000. Dr. Salling has published works addressing computer applications in planning, data dissemination, geographic information systems, poverty, residential mobility, demography, environmental equity, and urbanization and its environmental impacts. He has taught courses on GIS, urban geography, statistical and computer models, and demography at Cleveland State University. Ms. Pérez is counsel for the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law, whose website describes the center as, quote, a nonpartisan public policy and law institute that focuses on the fundamental issues of democracy and justice, end quote. Ms. Pérez earned her undergraduate degree in political science from Yale University and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, where she received the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Excellence in Public Service. She served as Presidential Management Fellow, acting as a policy analyst for the United States Government Accounting Office and covering housing, health care, and other issues. She then earned her law degree from Columbia Law School, where she was a Lowenstein Public Interest Fellow. After law school, Ms. Pérez clerked for a federal district court judge in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania and for a member of the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. Ms. Pérez has worked on a variety of voting rights-related issues, including redistricting, list maintenance, and access to the ballot box. She is a frequent speaker before legislators, community groups, and other audiences. So we have a great panel today, and at this point I will turn it over to Dr. Salling.
Thank you. I'm going to make my comments sitting here and reading them so that I can get through them in time, so I apologize. Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss a subject that is a strong public interest and one that continues to resurface as census data are released and as the political impact of those numbers become apparent. Here's what we want to talk about. I will discuss the recent release of the state's population number from the 2010 census. It told us that Ohio will lose 2 of its current 18 congressional seats, and the pending release of more population data will be used to shape the political landscape of the state for the next decade and possibly longer. I'll do this by showing you what happened in the last 10 years. My focus is on Ohio. My knowledge on this subject largely stops at the Ohio border. I know less about what is happening in other states. I'm also not a constitutional lawyer and cannot address issues about court challenges and decisions, so I turn to the Brennan Center to give this forum depth in these areas. And Myrna provides that depth and will give us a picture of the redistricting process and issues across the country. She can also discuss what you and others can do to get involved. Let's talk about Ohio, and first clarify the difference between apportionment and redistricting. Apportionment is the allocation every 10 years of the census, after the census, of the 435 seats in the U.S. Congress to each of the states. It is done based on the percentage of population in each state. Because Ohio did not grow very fast and less than other states, we will lose 2 seats starting next year. Which 2? How the new districts are drawn will largely determine which incumbents are at greatest risk of losing out. I'm not here to speculate about that, except to say it won't be Republicans. But I get ahead of the story. For our discussion, redistricting is the drawing of boundaries within the state for congressional districts and the state's legislature. So how are the congressional and state legislative districts drawn in Ohio? Who does it? First, let's talk about the Ohio legislature. The apportionment board, made up of 5 people, the governor, secretary of state, state auditor, and 1 each from the Democratic and Republican parties in the state legislature, draws the boundaries for the 99 Ohio House and 33 Senate districts. Each Senate district includes 3 House districts wholly contained within it. The party with at least 2 of the 3 state offices, the governor, secretary of state, and auditor, rule the board and controls the drawing of the district's boundaries. There are rules in the state's constitution, however, concerning population equality and keeping counties and municipalities together when feasible. And there are backroom deals made within and between the parties. I'm not here to talk about those rules or dealings. How about congressional districts? The General Assembly, the state legislature, draws the congressional districts through legislation. The governor signs the bill. It is done through compromise between the parties when the House, Senate, or the governor are of different parties. But when all 3 are controlled by one party, as we have now and we had in 2001, well, woe is the other party. Hello, Democrats. There are within-party rivalries and negotiations too, of course, but those are worked out within party ranks. Very close population equality among districts has been upheld as a requirement for congressional districts, and so too have drawing districts in which minorities have reasonably good chances of electing a representative. And Myrna will speak to these criteria later. Data are critical to the process. The Census Bureau will be releasing geographically detailed 2010 census counts on a state-by-state basis starting in February. It will include population by race, Hispanic ethnicity, and voting age for small areas known as census blocks. Recent election results from the county boards of elections are then added. CSU, with help from colleagues at Ohio University, is creating that unified database for Ohio. In summary, the apportionment board draws the state legislative districts, and the state legislature draws the congressional districts. This will be done in the coming summer and fall. One could say, and I do, that the apportionment board indirectly influences the congressional districts through its drawing of the state legislative districts. If you can effectively control the state legislature with the help of redistricting, you can also effectively control congressional representation of the state as well. It must be said that the public plays a role too, for it elects the people who draw the boundaries. But I assert that the electorate plays a smaller role than one might think or want. I will say something about how the public may become more involved towards the end of my comments, and Myrna can add much to this issue as well. We all know that given the chance, achieving political power drives the redrawing of political districts, but other factors might be considered, and in some cases must be considered. Many think compactness is important, but there are other possible criteria, and again, Myrna will discuss some of them. But I want to talk about representational fairness. This is an idea that seeks a redistricting plan that does not unfairly favor one party over another. The objective is to minimize the difference between a party's representation in the state's total votes and its representation in the overall outcomes of the elections. If 60% of the electorate votes for Party A should win close to 60% of the seats at stake. If the party wins less than half of the state's votes, it should not get more than 50% of the seats. I will focus on this concept here. I want to talk about the power of unrestrained partisan redistricting in Ohio. The point I will make is that a process in which one party draws the lines produces the intended results. That statement may not sound too surprising, but let me demonstrate the power of redistricting in the hands of one political party in Ohio. Please note, though I am going to present data that show the benefits that Republicans have gained as a result of their control of redistricting in recent times, please understand the Democrats would have done the same thing if they had the opportunity. This is an argument about importance of redistricting and the impact that partisan control has on election outcomes, regardless of which party we're talking about. I want to emphasize in the strongest possible way, this is not a criticism of one party or another. So here we go. The Apportionment Board elected in 2000 created 99 Ohio House and 33 Senate district boundaries for the elections in 2002 through 2010. Here are the results. In 2002, the Republican candidates won 62 of the 99 seats, 63% of them, with only 56% of the total votes statewide. The split in the number of seats won was proportionate. If the split of seats won was proportionate to the 56% of the voters that the Republican candidates achieved, they would have won 7 fewer seats. Their representationally fair total would have been 55 instead of 62. In 2004, Republican candidates for the House won 59 of the 99 seats, 60%, while getting just over half, 52%, of the votes statewide. That gave them 8 seats more than what they would have won had the seats gone in proportion to the state's voters' preferences for Republican and Democratic candidates overall. In 2006, despite garnering less than half, 48% of the votes, Republicans won 53 seats, a majority. That is 6 seats done to how the districts were drawn back in 2001 by the Apportionment Board. It enabled the party in control of redistricting 5 years earlier to keep a majority in the House despite getting less than half of the votes. Without the disadvantage of geography, the Democrats would have taken the House in 2006. They had 52% of the votes. Instead, they had to wait until the Obama tidal wave in 2008 when they took control of the House 52 to 47. The Obama effect was so strong that the Democrats actually won 2 seats more than their share of votes. In the 2010 elections just passed, the Republicans turned to control of the House with 59 seats. They won 4 of those due to how the lines were drawn 10 years earlier. The pattern is the same in the Ohio Senate, where half of the 33 seats are at stake every 2 years. There are 16 or 17 seats contested every 2 years. Again, the party that drew the lines has been able to win a disproportionate share of seats every election. In 2002 election, with less than half of the votes, they won 9 of 17 races, a majority. In 2004, they won 13 of 16 seats, 81% of the seats at stake in the Ohio Senate, when their statewide votes were 63%. And that would seem to merit only 11 instead of 13 of the 16 victories or seats. Again, with fewer than half, only 42% of the votes in 2006, they managed to take 8 of 17 seats, 1 more than their vote share would indicate. It continues. In 2008, they won 58% of the vote while taking 81% of the Senate seats, 13 out of 16. And in the most recent election, they won 10 of 17 contested seats with only a bare majority of votes statewide, 51%. That, my friend, is the work of the Apportionment Board 10 years ago. As I said, the state legislature draws the congressional districts. The one-party controlled legislature 10 years ago had a goal in mind: give Democrats some easy, non-competitive districts by concentrating them in a few districts so that they had less chance of winning elsewhere. Spread the Republican votes around so that there is enough to ensure a probable Republican win. The result, Republican candidates won 12 of 18, 2/3 of congressional seats in both 2002 and 2004, with 57 and 51% of the votes in those years. Even more remarkable, in 2006 they won 11 of 18 races with only 47% of the statewide votes. Their boundary advantages seemed to drop in 2008 with only 9 of 18, half of the seats won, but they were able to do that with 46% of the vote. The partisan redistricting effect lasted through the 2010 election, winning 13 or 72% of the races while garnering only 56% of the vote. So with this most recent election, the voters again chose Republicans to control the Apportionment Board and the state legislature, and therefore the political landscape for the next decade or more. The one-party controlled legislature, which is at least partly in the majority now due to its ability to draw boundaries 10 years ago, is set to draw the congressional boundaries in its favor for the next decade. If they are good at it, and there's no Obama or similar game changer, they could maintain their advantage well beyond. Ohio's Democrats have a mountain to climb. Let's make the point In almost every election in the last 10 years, the party that had exclusive control over redistricting 10 years ago won a disproportionate number of elections compared to their vote totals. The only exception was the Obama effect in 2008, and that was only in the Ohio House. Let me repeat, this analysis is not aimed at those who drew the districts, nor their party. My purpose is to show what happens when the redistricting process allows one party to make the decisions. It is a huge advantage, one that I think few people really appreciate. Certainly few realize how the vote for governor, secretary of state, and state auditor can give such lasting advantage to one party. Which of us in Ohio can even name the new state auditor? Dave Yost. Given time limitations, I want to mention just one other thing. There will be more scrutiny of the redistricting process than ever before. One reason, aside from the heightened partisanship these days, is that today's technology now makes drawing boundaries by non-experts relatively easy, and it facilitates comparisons of plans using nonpartisan measures such as representational fairness, compactness, and others. Geographic information systems used via the internet can be used by the average citizen with a little bit of training to draw districts and evaluate the results. Nonpartisan and fair elections interest groups, especially, will be able to suggest plans that, based on measurable criteria, may be judged better by the public than those that the Apportionment Board and the legislature will draw this year. There are plans afoot by some interest groups to do just that. I'm going to stop there so that we have time to hear Myrna, so I'm going to turn it over to Myrna.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the City Club for having me. The best part of my job is being able to talk to citizens that care about their community, and all of you coming out in the cold weather is a testament of how engaged and active you are. You humble me and honor me by being here. Thank you very much. Our democracy wouldn't work without people like you. So this portion of our conversation is going to discuss who does redistricting in the rest of the country and how do they do it. We're also going to look at some issues that we can expect in this redistricting cycle that are going to be different than past redistricting cycles. Why am I here talking to you? It's because I work for a national nonprofit that's nonpartisan that is interested in promoting issues of democracy and justice. We do a lot of work on legislative redistricting, including public education, but we also provide technical assistance to legislators and community groups. So if any of you are members of community groups that are interested in the redistricting process, I hope you will be in touch. We are at your service. The very simple answer to who draws the lines across the country is that it varies. It depends upon the state, and it depends upon what lines we are talking about. In most states, the legislatures are the ones that are drawing the district lines. Many of those same legislatures also draw the congressional lines, but they're not always the same. In some states, you'll have one body drawing legislative districts, but another body will draw congressional districts. One thing that's also important to remember is that even though in most states the legislature has primary control, it doesn't stop there. The courts very frequently have to get involved if either the legislature is unable to meet its deadline or if people are unhappy with the map that they've produced. Now, academics and the public are going to have a lot of debate as to whether or not this involvement of the courts is beneficial. One thing that I do like to remind people is that a good redistricting process is one that is open and transparent and offers the public the opportunity to engage. And there are some people that believe that when the court has to impose a map, there are less opportunities for that engagement. Another thing is that while Lady Justice may be blind, she's not nonpartisan always. In many states, that's a funny line. You guys were all supposed to laugh. Like, I know I only have 15 minutes, but I have time for you laughing. In some states, the judges are elected. And in many states, judges are appointed by people that have particular partisan interest as well. So it is an open question as to whether or not judges getting involved after the legislature either did or didn't do their job makes the process better. And all of us should be asking that question critically when we think about our redistricting process. So how do we do it? As I said earlier, most states have the legislature be the primary persons in charge of drawing their state legislative districts and their congressional districts. But there are other people involved sometimes. For example, some states have what we call advisory commissions. An advisory commission is a body that sometimes has staff, sometimes have different people on it that suggest something to the legislature, and the legislature can either adopt it or tell them to go fly a kite. In some instances, states will have what we call backup commissions. That's when the state legislature isn't going to meet a deadline or they're deadlocked. They'll have someone else come in. In some states, primary control for the redistricting process is outside the legislature. Sometimes, though, the legislator or legislative members are still involved, and we call those politician commissions. So either politicians can appoint the people that are drawing, or politicians themselves can still serve on that body. So even though it's not the legislature as a whole, you still don't take the politics out of it. And then in some parts of the country, primarily in the West, we have what we call independent commissions or sometimes citizens commissions. And there are certain rules for people who can sit on those commissions to, that keep them some sort of independence from the legislative process and from legislators. It doesn't perfectly map for congressional districts, but there's a lot of overlap. There are different bodies that draw different things. I have taken out the states that currently only have one congressional district because nobody needs to draw those. And then how do they draw districts? The same thing is it depends. Different states have different criteria that they use. And one thing I like to emphasize is that criteria is basically a fancy technical term for state values. States have decided there are certain things we want to accomplish through our redistricting process, and they codify those processes either in the Constitution or in state legislatures. Now, we have to start with what the federal obligations are. The two big federal obligations are the standard of equipopulation and Voting Rights Act. Equipopulation is just a fancy way for saying that each number of districts needs to have about the same number of people. Again, there are different standards for what is considered equal enough for Congress than there are the state, and some states decide to put even stricter limitations than what the Supreme Court has said is constitutionally permissible. The Voting Rights Act is, in my opinion, one of our country's greatest civil rights laws, and it was designed to do a number of things. It gets involved in two ways in the redistricting process, which I will go into more depth later. But there's state criteria running around all over the place, and not every state has the same criteria. Some of the more common ones is one called contiguity. What does that mean? It means that each part of the district is touching each other. Things like water and bodies of water and islands introduce special problems of contiguity, but the states that have to deal with those have figured out ways around them. Political boundaries. This is basically meaning that there's some sort of adherence to already existing political units, whether that be county lines, city lines, town lines. One of my favorite things to discuss about political boundaries is that political scientists love this one because while many people think that this is what's a so-called neutral redistricting criteria, if you do consistent studies, you can see that there's a predictable partisan impact when you have strict fealty to existing political unit boundaries. And it kind of makes sense. Most of these boundaries were created 1 million years ago. Population has changed, demography has changed, and so over time and overall, there is a partisan impact to strict fealty to political boundaries. So just make sure you ask some questions when people start talking about political boundaries being a neutral criteria. Compactness. Political scientists love this one even better. There's about 36 different measures of compactness, and everybody either thinks the one named after them or the one named after their mentor is the best one. It basically means how close does the district look like a circle. And that becomes challenging because people don't live in neat circles. Counties aren't neat circles. And so when you're trying to think about compactness, you have to figure out how much do you want to sacrifice compactness for other criteria. Communities of interest is my favorite one to talk about because that is something that we all can be a part of. It is salient communities that need representation. Districts are not about lines on a map, they're about people, they're about representation, and it's very important that you all go back to your community and ask questions of your neighbors. What are our communities of interest? There are different standards as to what is called a community of interest, what is legally recognizable as a community of interest, but there's a role for all of us in that process. Partisanship and competition. This is done basically in one of two ways. Sometimes there will be limits on the line drawers as to how much they can use the redistricting process to either benefit themselves or their party, or sometimes it'll actively say, we as a state value competition, so we want districts that are competitive. And then nesting. Nesting is used when you try to make sure that the lower chamber of a legislature boundaries are coextensive with the upper chamber. So you'll have, for example, a couple of assembly districts that are going to need to be able to fit into a Senate district in some states. So as you can see, I have listed a number of how the states value these particular criteria. One that is most common in all the states is contiguity. One that is less common in terms of being reflected in the statutes and the Constitution is partisanship or competition. What I find fascinating about all of this is that there are fewer limitations on those drawing the lines for Congress. So Congress is more like the Wild West in more states. But again, redistricting is about trade-offs. It is impossible to optimize every single value that the state decides. And there needs to be hard choices made about which criteria is more important than another criteria and what do you do when there's a conflict. Mark has talked about some of the limitations that are placed on the line drawers in Ohio, so I'm not going to belabor that. And because redistricting is about trade-offs, you really do need to listen to what your teachers and parents told you when you were a child. You cannot judge a book by its cover. You do not know from a district boundary whether or not the district is a good district. What went into it? Sometimes districts are shaped a certain way because they have to deal with a river. Sometimes districts are shaped a certain way because an incumbent wanted to block out a challenger. And so you have all these nooks and crannies trying to get out incumbent houses. You don't know. Sometimes a district looks funny because all the districts around it had certain objectives that they needed to do, and this was the landmass that was going to satisfy the equipopulation standard. One of the things that I like to do is I like to ask citizens which district do they think is the best. I always get told that a particular district from my great state of Texas is one that is considered less irregular shaped than some of the other districts. And for those of you that are actually with us, it's the one in the middle on the bottom. You can't really see all of it. But that particular district, although not particularly irregularly shaped, the Supreme Court specifically concluded that that district was designed to dilute the minority strength of an emerging Latino population. There's another district that is very popular in terms of being a regularly shaped district, and that's a district out of Arkansas that does not satisfy the equipopulation requirements. That means that those voters in that district have a representational worth that is different than what the rest of their neighbors are in the district. So you can't decide whether or not a district is a good district just by looking at its shape. That doesn't mean that the shape doesn't tell you something, but you need to go a little bit deeper than that and don't just immediately have a bad reaction on the district based on what its shape is. So one of the things that I think we need to watch in this coming districting cycle is what opportunities are there for public engagement? As Mark said, there's actually redistricting software that people can use from the privacy of their home computers. Now that we have social networking opportunities, community members that care about redistricting can find each other, and they can band together and they can have conversations. My hope is that people will leverage these technological opportunities and actually go out there and use that to make the redistricting process more open and more transparent. Another issue to watch is that of minority representation. Redistricting can have very big consequences on minority populations. In some instances, the redistricting population can be used to fragment a sizable minority population. One of my favorite examples was Koreatown in LA in the early 90s. I'm sure many of you remember that there was a great deal of racial unrest and a lot of damage that was done. But Koreatown, which was only about a square mile, was split into 4 districts. And those poor people were unable to get anybody to help them rebuild because everybody kept telling community members to go to the next district because there wasn't any large enough group of them in any one particular district. Sometimes you have the opposite problem, which is what we call packing, and that's when minority communities are overly concentrated in a particular district so that there's not enough of them in the surrounding districts to be able to have political control. So what happens now? We have the Voting Rights Act. There are two particular provisions of the Voting Rights Act that are very important when it comes to representational fairness. One is what we call Section 2, and that is the anti-dilution provisions. That's basically a fancy lawyer's way of saying you can't have a device or a practice that seeks to dilute or diminish the opportunity of a minority community to have equal opportunity to elect their candidate of choice and to participate in the political process. So it guards against those sorts of efforts. Then we have Section 5. Section 5 is a pre-clearance provision, and unlike Section 2, which applies all across the country, Section 5 only comes into play in certain parts of the country. And in those instances, the history of racial discrimination in elections was so egregious that there was a decision made that no electoral change can occur unless the Department of Justice or a three-judge panel decides that the change is not going to make the minority community worse off. There are some places, especially in the South, where the entire state is covered. So right down to school boards, to counties, unless there's a specific exemption, if you want to change your district lines, you need to get approval in advance that it's not going to have a deleterious effect. There are other parts of the country, and those are the lighter shades for those of people that are able to view the slides, that we call partially covered. And that means only certain jurisdictions are subject to these pre-clearance requirements. But the law is always in flux, as the law is. There are challenges across the country to different provisions of the Voting Rights Act. I am watching two of interest. One is in Alabama and one is in North Carolina. And depending on how those results come out, what the Voting Rights Act does and how much it can protect may be changing. Another issue to watch is that of partisan gerrymandering. What is a partisan gerrymander? That is a gerrymander whereby people try to use the redistricting process to either benefit themselves or their party. Now, this is a very thorny issue and vexing issue for community members, because while the Supreme Court has said there are some partisan gerrymanders that can be so egregious that they're unconstitutional, they haven't yet been presented one that was. And some of us have seen some doozies that we thought, you know, if not this, then what? It becomes even more complicated when you're talking about issues of representational fairness, because there's a question as to how partisan issues correlate with race. Some people think that there are synergies, some people think that there's competition, and this is one of the things that make partisan interests in redistricting very, very challenging for people to deal with. Another thing that I am watching is how the reforms that are happening across the country are making out. There have been a number of reforms, and we're going to talk about about some of those briefly. The first one I want to talk about is in the state of California. There was a ballot initiative whereby the citizens decided to take the redistricting process out of the hands of the legislature and give it to an independent commission, a citizens commission. And there are certain rules for who could sit on it, what that composition needed to look like. There are certain rules for how they are going to be drawing those lines, and there are certain rules regarding transparency. And obviously they haven't done their work yet, but I'm watching to see whether or not this is a model or something that other states can have. Another really interesting ballot initiative occurred in Florida. Now, this did not change the redistricting process because the legislature are still the ones that are going to get to draw the district lines, but it placed new restrictions. And one of the restrictions it did was say that you cannot draw districts that either favor or disfavor a political party. There are a lot of people that think that this is not a workable standard. In fact, the standard is being sued, or the implementation of this is being sued by current incumbents who think either the process is unfair or unworkable, or probably a little bit of both. So I'm very interested in seeing how this one turns out. The other reform is that of prison-based gerrymandering. Now, what is prison-based gerrymandering? This arises out of a particular census policy. The census currently counts prisoners in the district in which the prison is, and not in their home community. And there are a number of people that think that this leads to great deals of representational distortion, because that means the people outside of the prison but still in the district, have more weight than those people who are in the district next door, but then there's no prison. So one big reform that I'm very glad occurred was the fact that the census is going to be giving states the data on where the prisons are and who's in them with enough time that the state themselves can decide to reallocate people for redistricting purposes. And so we have 3 states, New York, Delaware, and Maryland, that have chosen to do that. They passed legislation saying we're going to reallocate people to their home community, not in this district that they have no connections, no ties in, something they can't vote on. And this is going to be very interesting both from a technical standpoint, how are they going to determine what is a home community, how many people go back, that sort of thing, but also a representational interest. We need to see how many lines are changing. So in terms of a recap, there are new opportunities for public engagement. You need to follow federal law, population equality and minority representation, and you need to put that on top of the state laws. You also need to look beyond shape. You do not judge a book by its cover when you're talking about redistricting. Watch out for self-dealing. If you see somebody targeting some of their political opponents, that should set off your spidey sense to be sort of watching to see what else is going on with that district. And let's see how the new reforms do, whether or not they make the redistricting process more transparent, more responsive to the people, and less rancorous. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring Mark Salling, Director of the Northern Ohio Data and Information Service and Levin College Fellow, and Myrna Pérez, Counsel Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. We'll return to them in a moment for our traditional City Club questions and answers. Start formulating your questions now, and please remember to keep them brief and to the point. We remind you that members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we certainly hope that everyone listening will join the City Club and become very active in our ongoing civic dialogue. Please visit our website, www.cityclub.org, to see a full schedule of our upcoming programs. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partners, WVIZ, PBS, IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcasts are supported by the University of Akron. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by the law firm Baker and Hostetler and by Congresswoman Marcia Fudge. Thank you very much for your support. Now we would like to return to our speakers for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Membership and Marketing Manager Heather Sikora and Development Assistant Lucille Barbati. First question, please.
I think that the material you gave us would best be delivered in a 3-day seminar. There was certainly a lot to chew on there. Given what we are settled with in Ohio, or saddled with, what can be done as we undergo these processes in front of us? Is there anything that can be done without a change in law?
You want to start?
There's certainly a great deal that can be done, and that is get involved, talk to your neighbors. Ohio doesn't have particular requirements about, public hearings, et cetera, but that doesn't mean that hearings don't occur. You can stay on your legislators about making sure that they inform the public when there are opportunities to engage. You can talk to your community members about finding out what are important communities of interest. You can talk to your legislators and tell them which communities that you think need to have certain kinds of representation and which ones shouldn't be split apart. You can get on the web and use Facebook and use Twitter and find other people that are interested in the redistricting process. It's really important that when you cannot have structural change because of the way the timing works, that you use the status quo to the best of your advantage and you hit all of the access points. And there's a lot of them. So talk to your neighbors, make sure that the legislators are hearing from you, look at some maps, and do your best to be engaged and involved.
And let me add that the process in Ohio is not completely decided yet in terms of how the public might have some input. The apportionment board won't meet until August. They could decide to allow for some sort of public input, suggestions on districts and that sort of thing. And the state legislature could do the same thing. 10 years ago, we were actually asked by the Secretary of State to do some training of several boards of elections around the state. The Secretary of State provided some computers, some software, and the staff at those boards of elections were to provide some help to citizens who wanted to get on the computer, play with the software, come up with some plans, some districts for maybe just their area or for the whole state, and offer those up to the legislature. And we did some training of those Board of Elections staff people. I don't know that it was used very much. Probably wasn't, in fact. But you know, this time around, as I was trying to say, the software has become a lot easier to use. The internet is there, so you don't have to go to a Board of Election 100 miles away, sit down at a computer and have somebody over your shoulder showing you what to do. There are going to be some relatively easy software systems that are going to be made public, free, for the user to get on. Maybe you have to do a little bit of training, a tutorial a little bit first. If you're not very good with computers, this may be an issue, but for most people who have a little bit of facility with computers, you should be able to use such a system and create something. Now, whether or not the legislature or the apportionment board will actually allow for input or accept input or set up a system for receiving such input is one issue. But the other issue is you could always do it yourself and take a look at what the legislature or what the apportionment board has drawn after the fact and say something about it. Now, I don't know, it's after the fact, but maybe if you wanted to do that, if somebody, interest groups, like I said before, do that, maybe they'll have some input and persuasion over the process while it's going on.
Thank you. You've really made clear how this can undermine our democratic process and how complex some of the issues are. My question is, why can't we take not just politicians, but human beings out of this by developing algorithms that we could agree on far in advance, because otherwise politicians will get involved, that will determine how we take the key factors such as equality of population, contiguity, and minority representation, and adopt those. And then they would be totally transparent. Everybody could have those and would know what the results were going to be.
Yeah, I think as Myrna said, that you have to come up with what you think are important, your values, in order to come up with the set of criteria that you're going to use and what weights they have, because you can say one thing is more important than another. For example, is competitiveness more important than being able to allow people in a district to have the representative they want? Is it better to have 70% who are happy with the outcome of the election and 30% who are unhappy, or do you want 51% happy and 49% unhappy with the outcome? Those are the kinds of decisions you have to make. The Secretary of State, Brunner, our last Secretary of State, had a competition at the request of some citizens groups to test the idea that you could set up some criteria that a lot of people would agree with, and you could tweak the weights of those criteria, and see if over the internet, using this software that I mentioned, with some training, people could, anywhere in the world, submit a plan, and it would be scored. It was scored, and see whether or not you could come up with a plan that met certain criteria. That competition resulted in some winners of it, and those winning plans, quantitatively, when you scored things, were better than the existing plan that was put in place in 2001. Not only that, but all the plans that were submitted were better than the plan submitted in 2001. So it could be done. There was some discussion a year ago by both the Republicans and the Democrats to change how the process is done. That failed to come to fruition. It did not get on the ballot this last fall. So we have a process in place that won't change, at least this time around.
Okay.
The question is, why not change it now for 2020?
If I may, I mean, this is one of the most common questions that I get, and the very simple answer is that I don't know that there's a computer smart enough to make all those judgment calls. Redistricting, in many ways, it's a blood sport, and you have to get down on the ground, and you have to figure out, what is this a real community? Is the boundary the river? Is the boundary the railroad? Is the boundary? And we can start off with computers and kind of make it do certain big swaths, try to get the numbers right. But once you have the numbers, that's only part of the game. That's only part of the game, and you can't, because you can't optimize anything without necessarily taking from something else. These criteria are zero-sum. You need to have people involved making those calls. And so, I think that is an appealing response, but there's just not a computer that's going to be smart enough to do it, even if, presuming that we could get agreement on what the best criteria were and how to order them. Even once we do that, we still need to make on-the-ground judgment calls. And a computer can't do it. We have to be involved. We have to do it.
Thought I heard you say that in some cases the courts they were challenged. The districting was challenged in court. Could you describe some of those and how it worked? Did it affect the following redistricting? Did it affect the redistricting of that particular year? And what was so egregious about the redistricting that the courts took it up and did it themselves?
Okay, I'm happy to do that. That's a great question. They're not consistent trends because different states have different criteria, and you can go into court based on what you think is a violation of state law, right? So that's sort of the big picture. One of the things that I find very interesting is that sometimes courts espouse certain principles as being a state principle that isn't actually in the Constitution or isn't actually in the statutes, and then that becomes a criteria for the state. And that may or may not be a way of doing things, but it is in fact true that courts add to the body of law. They do that in every aspect of our life, and redistricting is no different. So a court decision for one redistricting cycle could have remnants that become part of the next redistricting cycle unless something overturns that. Sometimes courts have to get involved because it looks like there won't be a districting map done in time. I mean, the name of the game is this has to be done before every state has their primaries, right? And if there are political deadlocks or if there are problems with the data or people can't agree or there's a scandal or something along the line, sometimes the courts have to step in. And then sometimes they have to step in because a district was unfair, where it denied certain people representational fairness or it wasn't equal enough. One of the equi-population standards that I was talking about allows for deviation in state legislative districts when you have a good reason. So sometimes you need a good reason. Like I work in New York, and there are a lot of people that think that the legislature is a little too casual about the flexibility that they're allowed. In terms of trying to make it relatively equal, and that they don't provide good enough reasons for why you have one district that is 10% different than another district, because the Supreme Court has said that it's not constitutionally problematic unless it's more than 5% over the average district or less than 5%. So it's a bunch of different reasons, but the courts are certain important actors. Sometimes people use lawsuits to try and goad the state legislature into action. Right now there's a lawsuit in Minnesota. Minnesota doesn't have the data yet. They're arguing that they're malapportioned, and that is true. That's why we're doing redistricting right now. And there's already a presumption by some people that either the map isn't going to work or it's not going to be done in time. And so the courts are getting involved soon. So the courts are definitely, the big elephant in the room that, can help the process, can hurt the process, but is certainly involved in the process.
Any one of those suits based on political advantage?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there have been numerous cases in which people are challenging the plan as being a partisan gerrymander. It was trying to go after people. However, there has not been one decision in which a court said, yep, that's the one that's unconstitutional. They've said, yes, in theory they could be unconstitutional, but they have not found one yet. In part because it's a legislative struggle, right? And how much of it is a getting after somebody, how much of it is a policy choice, and it becomes a really thorny issue for courts to step into.
Yeah. First, I wanted to thank Mark Salling, who's done just wonderful data analysis for our community, and I think it's really wonderful that all these years. My question sort of follows up on the others. I've heard from at least one very knowledgeable state legislator that essentially this is going to go through the way it did the last time, that this is going to be very partisan, and that's how it is, and that there's no chance that any facts are going to change that. My question is, if using Mark's kind of statistics that show that there's a equilibrium between the percentage of people that are voting and how the votes are turned out, and statistically demonstrable the way he has shown, and you project that, would that be subject to a suit? I think a lawsuit is about our only chance here in Ohio, and would equal protection be part of that?
This is going to be a very unsatisfying answer to you, and the answer is that I couldn't responsibly tell you without knowing what facts are on the ground and how it actually worked out. One of the precepts of our legal standard and our legal system is that you actually deal with concrete problems, not hypothetical issues, and that's a hypothetical that I'm not in a good position to say. I do know that there are certain state and federal laws that limit the amount of abuse that legislators, or limit the discretion is probably a better way of saying it, what legislators can do, but whether or not any of those protections are triggered depends upon what happens at the end of the day and what sort of evidence you have proving whatever you think the injury is.
Well, suppose the evidence.
Let me just say, I'm not a lawyer, and I have no idea what the right answer is. But I mean, as a citizen, I would think that in a situation in which 58% of the voters did not get the representative that they wanted in a state because of redistricting, that's evidence that would be possibly usable in a court challenge. Now, again, I don't know anything about these things, but...
Well, you can also use it for public outrage. I mean, one of my favorite things to do is to keep track of the political abuse of the day, because it is right after the redistricting process happens when people are so angry. That's when you should be talking to your legislators to try and get systematic reform. Legislators are more apt to do something about it when it's not going to affect them for a little while, right? Because we're not going to have the census data, so you can appeal to people's better angels. So even if you experience a bad redistricting process, keep track of the abuses, talk to the media, get them all riled up, get them on your side, and talk to your community members about what meaningful reform should look like, and strike right after the redistricting process, because people aren't going to be able to look into their crystal balls and see how it's going to affect them.
Yes, back in the 60s when Baker versus Carr came in and states reacted to it, Ohio did their reform to separate the partisanship, or at least the check and balance, taking the legislature out of it and creating this hybrid apportionment board absent any computers. We had a box of Crayolas
cards,
and a
right.
few
I've heard about those cards.
How do you reconcile that fact that, I mean, we need to revisit all the time and include all those kinds of things? But beyond that, I want to stay on your court point. The issue started with Baker versus Carr, at least in our lifetime, and each and every apportionment in Ohio has ended up in the court. So some secret meeting on a partisan basis, a judge or a panel of judges are making decisions. And we don't have transparency. So somehow, whatever transparency we put into it is terminated along the path to justice, vis-a-vis the Scalia presidency. There wasn't a lot of debate about that, but the reality is it's going to end up with somebody drawing it in line, in secret, without hearings. And they add, as you indicated, they add constitutional provisions we never heard of before.
I'm sorry, and your question is?
Reconcile that for me. How does one approach that? How does one approach that as we do this macro reorganization of redistricting and reapportionment?
Okay, well,
when we know the results are going to end up.
I'm a civil rights lawyer, right? So I believe that with the proper mix of incentives, education, and penalties, you can change things, and I can see why it would be easy to get discouraged about the ability to make the process more fair, but I can't advocate a position of not doing anything, and I can't advocate a position of not trying. And my hope is that the more people that are active and engaged in the redistricting process, the more people that work really hard with their legislators, the more people that talk to their neighbors, things are going to get better. They certainly couldn't get worse, right? I mean, they certainly can't get more closed.
Yeah, and we also have, the Obama effect. I mean, so something could change radically that means that there's a turnaround at some point. How lasting it is another question.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to Mark Salling and Myrna Pérez address redistricting in Ohio and across the country. Thank you very much for your informative remarks. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.